Welcome to the third in a series of interviews with candidates to replace Representative Niki Tsongas in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Peggy Wargelin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress. Today we welcome Jeff Ballinger, longtime social justice advocate. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Most of the questions will be about your knowledge and philosophy of government, as well as your strategies for making decisions. We'll end with a lightning round asking you to quickly comment about other issues important to our members. Let's start with a 2-minute biography. What would you like voters to know about you?
Well, I'm a social justice advocate and spent years abroad for the AFL-CIO, about 11 years altogether. And so it's mostly in Asia, but also have experience in Western Europe. So it gave me an opportunity to see different kinds of capitalism. And I think most Americans don't realize that, we have a very sort of rapacious form of capitalism here. So I've been bringing that message home to Americans as much as I could. And the vehicle I used to do most of my education about the global political economy was through a corporate campaign I did. I took the Nike Corporation as an example of how U.S. businesses operate abroad through contractors. Now, I observed them at close hand in Indonesia. And I quit a job I dearly loved. I was like an ambassador for the AFL-CIO, and it was a really nice job. Your boss is 12,000 miles away, and you run a little office, and nobody bothers you. But when I saw what was going on in these shoe factories, I said, Americans have to know. So, I kept in touch with these factories from a base in Istanbul. And this was before the internet, so I had to do it all by fax and by phone. But I kept in touch with these 8 Nike producing factories in Indonesia, had a very narrow focus, and I took that story back. After 5 years, finally Americans started to pay attention. I moved back to the US in '96, and it kind of exploded. So, I think we reached tens of millions of Americans with this story because Nike's sales in the US started to drop because of this information. People didn't want to be associated with this exploitation. So that's sort of my way of operating, is to take an example that's easy to understand and explains a lot about how the global economy works. And I think Americans need to know more. And I think Donald Trump is an example of how they responded to this idea of trade not working for them. Now, he had the right problem, but kind of for the wrong reason. It wasn't bad trade deals. It was our corporations left America long before these trade deals were negotiated. So, that's kind of my approach to, teaching my fellow citizens about how the global economy works.
Okay. The first group of questions asks about your opinions about the federal government. What types of programs should the federal government be responsible for?
Well, I think the federal government should definitely have a bigger role in education than it plays right now, because if you base education solely on local property taxes, you see the result we get. It's not very good. And so I think they've got to have a bigger role in education instead of less of a role, which we're seeing happening now. And certainly they have to be involved with healthcare. They should run healthcare. I don't think insurance companies have any place to be in the healthcare delivery field, because you have 4,000 different kinds of coverage, and it only adds this bureaucratic morass. And it takes, everybody in America by now is familiar with the fact that amongst developed countries, we have the most expensive health care, and part of the reason is the insurance company. So I'm for single payer, and I think that would be a key thing for our government to provide for us, like most developed economies do. So those are 2 areas. And I think we have to be more forward-thinking about job prospects for this coming generation, because it's no cinch to find data and predictions about what kind of industries we're going to have. So I'm for resuscitating the Division of Economic Research at the National Labor Relations Board. We used to have it. They killed it in the 50s because of the Red Scare. You know, they thought it was full of communists. So actually, this is very important. So we know what jobs are needed in the near term and the medium term, and we can prepare our kids for this new economy. And you know, in other countries, like in Germany, the businesses do this. Businesses train, they see what's coming down the road, and they train, you know, through apprenticeship programs and things to have the workforce they need to compete. And you know, the Germans out-export us by double. You know, as a percent of GDP, they export about 25%, and we about 12% in the US. So, you know, I really think that businesses can be better at anticipating what kind of jobs are going to be needed, and but the government ought to be involved as well.
Okay. Describe one program run by the federal government you feel is especially successful and effective, and explain why you think that is so.
Boy, I don't think we do anything very well. It's really hard to think of something that you couldn't improve a lot, you know. So I believe the VA gets a bad rap. You know, they've got 360,000 staff, and they have to maintain facilities in, you know, rural places, you know, so they've got a huge task to do. And I really think that they do a fair job of delivering service for the vets. And the vets don't want this privatized. You know, I was talking to some veterans yesterday, and they're adamant that, you know, the plan to privatize part of this is just anathema to them. So they really want to increase, you know, services, and you know, maybe the private sector is needed in places where they can't provide all the services that are necessary. But I really think the VA does a good job with the resources available to it.
Okay. Now describe a federal program you feel is not successful. What improvements would you suggest?
Oh, I think Congress has to look at the Pentagon's budget. They just haven't done an audit in a decade or longer, you know, and to give $770 billion without saying a word about how that money is spent, really. I mean, they let the Pentagon decide. They, you know, they need 2,400 F-35 fighter jets when our allies have 500 more. I mean, it just seems ridiculous. And my wife is always laughing about this one graphic of Bernie Sanders. He's standing next to a bar graph where it's a defense spending, and he says, where are our enemies? You know, why do we need this kind of spending? And, you know, beyond the amount, I mean, how they spend it has to be, you know, addressed, because on top of all these fighter jets, you have veterans, I mean, you have active service members that qualify for food stamps because of the affordable housing affordability crisis we're in. So it's tens of thousands. You know, the last number we have is 26,000 from 2013, but the Pentagon won't tell us their number. The USDA won't tell us their number. And I have a feeling it's nearer 40,000 military families that are qualified for food stamps. And what happens when Donald Trump gets his dream and he axes SNAP? You know, what's happened to these military families? So definitely, far and away, number one is the Defense Department. But if I could give an honorable mention to the National Labor Relations Board, workers' rights are not protected in our country. And I was organizing workers in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, and I hesitated to tell workers that their rights were protected by the federal government, because they're not protected. And we tried to reform the labor law in 1977 and failed. A 5-week filibuster by the Republicans that stopped that modest reform of the labor laws. And, you know, as I said earlier, most Americans know that, you know, our health care delivery system is low compared to other developed nations, but our protection of worker rights is even lower. Most developed economies allow workers to organize, and they force companies to bargain with the unions once they're elected. So this is not happening in America, and it's in the private sector. You know, union membership is down below 7%.
Yeah. Okay. When is it appropriate to make use of private sector resources like outsourcing and public-private partnerships for government functions?
I think only when you don't have the expertise available in your department, or it would be cost prohibitive to hire people. It would be the only reasons I could see outsourcing government jobs. If you can do it in-house, do it. It seems the opposite, however, in like the private sector, where the former dean of the Stanford Business School said you have to be ruthless about outsourcing. You know, and he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, and I don't ever remember ruthlessness being in the lexicon of economists, you know, but it's been a ruthless process, and I don't think it needs to be in the government sector, except, of course, when you have to, when your back's against the wall.
Sure. Okay, what federal government programs have you or members of your extended family benefited from?
Well, I benefited tremendously from USAID. The Agency for International Development funded the work I was doing abroad, and I think it's an unsung hero of American foreign policy. And they don't toot their own horn very much. You don't hear a lot about what USAID does, but you know, I had very good success with a couple of programs. They gave me a small human rights grant while I was in Indonesia, for example, to monitor compliance with the minimum wage, which was 86 cents a day at the time. And you know, you think, well, okay, it's a very cheap place to live, but 80% of the women in these factories working for that wage were anemic. I mean, it was not enough to live on, and they worked long hours of overtime just to get up to, you know, something approximating a living wage. Well, after this human rights grant I got, American businesses were complaining about my drawing attention to contractors for them not paying the minimum wage. So I kind of thought, well, you know, maybe USAID won't give me a grant again. They doubled down, they more than doubled down. They gave me a grant 20 times bigger. It was $650,000, which, you know, for a small office like mine, allowed us to hire 200 surveyors to go in the field for 2.5 years, and the number of strikes quadrupled, because it turned into basically a legal literacy kind of program, because these workers didn't know what they were entitled to. And once they knew, they kind of pressed their bosses to deliver. And, you know, we got the wage up to $2.40. And, you know, if you talk about return on investment, now if USAID's role is to reduce poverty, this is one of the best investments they ever made, because this was not just for the shoe workers. This was for all 4.5 million formal sector workers. Their wages rose $1.70, you know, and just do the math. It's like billions for a very small investment.
Cool. All right. The next set of questions is about how you obtain and use information. What is a fact to you, and how are facts important in your decision making?
Well, facts are, we all used to agree what facts are. Remember, we all used to have the same frame of reference, because there were 3 major newspapers and maybe 5 big magazines and 3 networks, and so we all kind of knew what the facts were, and this worked to my advantage in the Nike campaign, because everybody knew. Once you heard those facts about these factories, Americans agreed this is exploitation. But now, you know, you'd have all these fake news bubbles popping all over, and people would say, well, not sure about this guy's, you know, anyway. So the way I go about gathering facts is go to the people who know, like in the Toys R Us case, right? Okay. I went to talk to workers just before they closed these stores. 33,000 workers lost their jobs because Bain Capital did a leveraged buyout of Toys R Us. They borrowed $5 billion, and they dumped the $5 billion debt on Toys R Us, and they were trying at the same time to modernize a little bit and sell things on, you know, compete with Amazon, which is not an easy thing to do, and to modernize their stores. And their suppliers got a little nervous. They said they've got a huge amount of debt. Are they going to be able to pay for the next shipment? And it just crushed them. The debt crushed them. And Bain pocketed $50 million for this. And so this is how I gather facts. I go out and I talk to the workers. They're not going to see any severance pay. We talked face to face with some managers even. And they said, you know what, the bankruptcy industry is going to collect $340 million from this bankruptcy. But those workers won't get any of the severance pay they were promised. And you know, this is the kind of thing that I do, and I take these facts out. And in this campaign, I've been talking about U.S. corporations nearly 5 or 6 times every debate. I don't think anybody else has mentioned the corporation maybe once or twice. Now, think about it. If Americans, they kind of have this feeling that corporations are running Washington, I think you have to talk about corporations or you're not talking about the way our government is operated.
Yeah. Okay. Do you verify information provided to you? How do you decide what sources of information to trust?
Well, look, I trust the New York Times and I trust NPR almost implicitly, but I'll give you a caveat. They slip in the neoliberal worldview, almost so you don't notice. Like I have these Planet Money people in my mind telling me, oh, free trade is good, free trade is good. And when the debates were going on, I was thinking, well, it hasn't been free trade. Whoever thought it was a good idea to have unfettered free trade with countries that throw journalists in jail and religious leaders in jail and union leaders in jail. You can't have unfettered free trade with these countries. And when Bill Clinton opened the door of the WTO to China, I mean, they had already been exporting a lot to the United States, but this just kind of institutionalized, a bad system. And so I think this is what we have to do, is take a look beyond what's being told. In the case of this neoliberal philosophy, we have to kind of unpack the concepts of, free trade and compare it to what would be fair trade. Like if you look at the WTO, one of the loopholes that the Chinese have is that their state banks can lend to Chinese corporations, and it's not called a subsidy. Well, I mean, not in anybody else's eyes except the WTO. So I really think this is what you have to do, is go into the mechanics of how the system is working, and that's what I've been doing.
Okay. How do you communicate with people who trust different information sources than you do?
Well, I think all you can do is be patient and, give them objective facts. And as I was just describing, what the rules of the WTO, for example, I think there's no argument. They could say, well, I don't believe you, but then if they go and check, what I was saying against, what the rules actually are, then, that's the only thing you can do, is lay it out in a way that is understandable to a layman. Not everybody's, I'm not an economist, but I think economists got us into the mess we're in. So I really think as an advocate, you have to lay out things in a very simple manner, and that's what I've tried to do all my career, is to make this information accessible to people, and that's why I think I've been successful. I was on the front page of the Washington Post. My methodology of presenting information, researching it and presenting it, was featured in a front page article in the Washington Post. They were trying to explain why Americans responded to these stories of workers being exploited in faraway places.
Sure. All right, let's move on to the specific elected position you're running for. Why do you want to be the U.S. Representative for Massachusetts District 3?
Well, it's kind of simple, and it may even sound simplistic, but I really think we need a fighter for worker rights that, I haven't heard a lot in Washington about worker rights. And, the Democratic Party made a turn to corporate fundraising, even before the Clinton years. But during the Obama years, it was the most incredible increase. The number of $100,000 contributors increased by 12-fold just during the Obama years. So people who gave $100,000 or more increased 12 times in the 2008 to 2016 period. So, I think getting money out of politics is the first priority. And, the bill that was authorizing the new Pentagon budget a year ago, when they were debating a year ago in July, 60% of House Democrats voted for a budget $50 billion more than Trump was asking for. And there's only one explanation for this: is to curry favor with defense contractors. That's why a Democrat would who in a normal case, because it's a discretionary pie. Whatever you give to the Pentagon, you're taking away from food feeding programs and after-school programs and all the things that Democrats are now complaining about being cut. But they were upping, even the Trump proposed budget. So I think we've got to rein in Pentagon spending, but in order to do that, we've got to stop the corporations controlling our Congress, and so Americans have just suffered because of this flow of money into politics. And I'll give you one more example: is the Air Corporation, wind turbine corporation, that had its technology stolen by its biggest customer, a Chinese firm called Sinovel. 2011, they went from 900 employees to 200 because their biggest customer stole their technology. But in January this year, a federal court, the first ever intellectual property theft case against a Chinese company, this company, AMSC and Air, won. And they said it was $800 million worth of damage that was done to this company. And so why I'm telling this story is no Democrat from the House Energy and Commerce Committee thought to call a press conference and say, hey, this is why we have government. This is why we have regulation, because this is the Economic Espionage Act of 1995, and it worked. And I talked to the AMSC executives, and they were very happy with the job the Department of Justice did. 7 years it took them to win this case. And so the Republicans have so demonized government and regulation for 40 years that when we win one, we better say something, and I really think that I'm going to do this more than anything, is just when we have an effective use of the regulations, we have to be talking about it. Now, as a side note, 2-3 weeks ago, this company settled for only $57 million out of the $800 million damage that was caused. They were desperate. I think they were, they got the best deal they could, obviously. But if Donald Trump, who has made intellectual property theft a big issue, if he would have weighed in on their behalf, and if the Democrats would have been saying, something about this case, it might have increased. I'm still going to fight for restitution for these workers. Long story short, I'm going to follow this case and fight for restitution for these 700 workers, whether I'm elected or not.
Okay. How long have you lived in the district?
I've lived in the district 9 years.
Okay. This is a very diverse district. How do you plan to represent the interests of people with such varying concerns and views of what government can and should do?
Well, I feel like I'm in sort of in the same social strata and economic strata with most of the district that's west of Lowell. But on the other side, where you have communities that are struggling or less well off, these are my people. I mean, I grew up in a mill town, a factory town, and 6 kids and in a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom, and so this is son of a steel worker. And I just think that I've fought for these people, the lower rungs of the economic ladder, my whole life. So that's kind of how I square the circle. I'm with people in the western part of the district, sort of culturally and economically, but I've fought for and feel kinship with the others. And if one thing that's been absent in this race, in the debates, is a discussion of racism. I think we have a terrible problem in the United States. And if you have a country with 40 million people below the poverty line, which in itself is a problem, but the fact that so many of them are people of color is very disturbing to me, and I think that we have to do things to redress the balance, and the education thing I mentioned earlier is just one element of that.
Sure. Let's see, what concerns do you hear about from voters most often, and what are the issues you are most concerned about personally?
Well, I think there's a great concern with health care, of course, and that's always been a concern of mine. We're taking care of a family member who's for 3 years has been, a virtual invalid, and scheduling aids for her and dealing with insurance problems and pharmaceutical problems and all these things that I really feel for these caregivers that are they're a dwindling number. It used to be 7 to 1 the caregiver to needy person ratio, but it's going to be down to 3 to 1 in 10 or 15 years.
Wow.
So this is it's a terrible problem, and so I think healthcare would be number one, but also the economic benefits that workers didn't receive when the economy was supposedly booming. All of the this wealth gap that we have started about 40 years ago, and no coincidence when unions were struggling to organize workers, the 20% going up and the 80% declining. So I really think that's people are angry about that, and it partly explains why Donald Trump was elected, because he pushed that button, and the Democrats had kind of ceded that territory to a demagogue like him. That was a tragedy from my perspective, because we weren't vocal, because the Democrats weren't talking about how to help workers.
Sure. Please tell us about how you're financing your campaign.
Well, that's a very simple question. I've got little retirement savings, and that's virtually it. We've got a donate button on our web page that isn't been used very often. Maybe 10 or 12 donations, checks came in that way from friends, and no, it's all self-financed, and haven't really been making an effort to go out and raise money. And I'd like to make this a referendum on money in politics, really. I'd like for the person who has the least money, or one of the two that has the least money, to go against people in the top tier. The three in the top tier average 1.8 million. So I really think this is, these people are going to be answering phone calls from these contributors, for, every time they call, and they're going to be dialing for dollars, when they're not, taking calls from their contributors. So I really think that system is not for me, and that's why I've chosen to, self-finance.
Sure. What are your criteria for accepting or declining contributions?
Well, I wouldn't take any fossil fuel money. Corporate PAC money, it would have to be some kind of special corporation, and there aren't many of those. I mean, we do have some good corporations, don't get me wrong. I think the New Balance company, still making shoes here in the 3rd District in Lawrence, and Southwick is making suits and shirts here in Lawrence, in Haverhill, and they're in the 3rd District. And so we do have good businesses, so I wouldn't, totally decline money from a better corporation, but really I think you can't take fossil fuel money or the pharmaceutical industry or any of the most rapacious and the ones that are having most influence, like defense contractors in Washington. Absolutely not.
Okay. National politics is increasingly marked by rancor and division, and dealing with this will be a large part of the job. Describe a past situation where you had to work to get something done with a group of people who strongly disagreed with your position.
Well, I have worked with conservatives on Poland, for example. And it was a workers' rights question for me. It was an anti-communism question for them, and so I do think we had sort of a meeting of the minds. So let's get rid of, the repressive regime. And you know what? We had to fight Citibank. Citibank was trying to prop up Jaruzelski because they had loans to the former communist regime in Poland. So, this was very important to me personally, to weigh in on the side of the workers, those brave workers who risked it all. And I think we changed the face of Europe. But also in this coalition, if you will, were people very different from me that were just conservative, anti-communist, and sort of knee-jerk, right-wingers.
Sure. What is your philosophy on legislative compromise?
Well, I think we have to compromise. There's no way, Democrats are, of course, in the minority across the board now. But when we had the majority, we did pass the Affordable Care Act, but we didn't pass the worker rights protections that we needed in that same, 2-year window. But I would go back to the George W. Bush immigration bill, which was a bipartisan bill. It was a path to citizenship, much like Ronald Reagan had normalized 3 million. This would have been closer to 8 or 9 million in the case of George W. Bush. But there were interests against this bill that benefit from people living in the shadows. Yeah. There are corporations and business associations that killed that bill, I feel, because that would make it easier for workers maybe to organize or maybe ask for a raise. And so I think that, this is a shame that this bipartisan effort, fell to, the lobbyists' acts in Washington.
Sure. Finally, let's touch quickly on some other issues important to our members. Please give a quick response to each issue. A woman's right to choose.
A woman should have the right to choose. I'm pro-choice.
Okay. Health care.
Health care, single payer.
Civil rights.
Civil rights, we have to extend. I think the Housing Rights Act was a total failure 50 years ago this year, and there was no enforcement. We didn't pressure these banks to stop redlining, and there was no enforcement whatsoever. We really have to work on that and a whole range of civil rights issues.
Sure. Net neutrality.
Net neutrality, we need to protect ourselves.
Yeah. Gun regulations.
I'm for strict gun regulation, and I would fight, I would take the fight to the NRA in a very personal way. I would target their corporate partners, because like FedEx, for example, is still a corporate partner of the NRA. And every time there was a school shooting or a church shooting, if I'm elected, I will be spending a day in front of a FedEx office near the Capitol for every person who was killed. I mean, that's what I would do. And just try and pressure the corporations who are still supporting the NRA and try and reduce their influence, because they are so powerful that we're not going to get any meaningful legislation passed as long as they're in the present situation.
Okay. The latest round of tax cuts.
Oh, it's awful. It was an abomination, and it should be repealed. And there's a way to do tax cuts that benefit all and would benefit businesses that are trying to, reshore jobs, bring jobs back to the United States. But not this tax cut.
Government policy for the situation in Puerto Rico.
I would just make Puerto Rico a state, or let them choose to become a state. I mean, it's their choice ultimately, but I really think we have to treat them like we treated Houston and like we treated other, terrible tragedies. It's, it's not acceptable what's happened up till now.
Sure. Immigration policy.
Immigration, I think we benefit from immigration, so I wouldn't be cutting back, certainly wouldn't be cutting back in the areas that Trump is proposing, and we have to extend this temporary protective status that many Central Americans have, and Haitians, and I would really get a path to citizenship going. I mean, I think we can do a bipartisan bill, certainly after a blue wave.
And finally, campaign finance reform.
Oh, I think this is #1 issue for me, because until we get the money changers out of the temple, we're not going to have any kind of legislation that helps people, because people don't have representatives. They've got some small voices, competing for attention with some big corporations and corporate interests and PACs that are dominant.
All right, thank you so much.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Yeah. So once again, thank you for joining us for the third in a series of interviews with candidates to replace Representative Niki Tsongas. I'm Peggy Wargelin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress.